Hey Nick, how you doing?
Wrecker, what's up, my brother?
Nothing much. Weekend is up. You're gonna be visiting me in a couple of days. I'm quite excited about this. I have a little present for you, but I'm
Oh
not gonna
no.
tell. I do have a present, so you still have some time to pick your back with a nice, meaningful gift for myself.
Do you like this t-shirt, God Country Notre Dame?
I
Absolutely
actually
not.
do. I like it a lot.
Oh,
We
we
can
can
bring
hear in the
that.
background. We hear in the background. We have a guest again today.
Ooh, well, let me tell you about our guest today. So, as we talked about in the last episode, a number of junior and mid-career faculty have come to me and said, "Listen, we really want to know what it means to get published." And when they say they get published,
Of
to really
course.
get published in a top journal. So, my own story, my first article that was published in a top journal, it was myself and three other PhD students. And if you
Oh.
look at the first version of this manuscript that we submitted to MIS Quarterly at the time, it was pretty tragic, right? But now, if you look at that paper, it's one I'm still proud of today. And it's a beautiful paper. And it's all because of one person, our senior editor, that saw a gem in that paper and kind of went out and helped us turn it into something decent. I think she did more than she probably should have. But looking back, I'm very well, and it's Dorothy Leidner. And yeah, so Dorothy, you don't even remember anymore, do you? You know which paper I'm
Oh,
talking about?
actually, I very much remember that paper, Nick, for several reasons. But one thing I regret is if you look at it, it doesn't list me as a senior editor. And I think it was one of the first ones that I
Oh.
accepted as
Wait,
my school. And I emailed Jan years later when I first noticed, like, oh my gosh, this has got the wrong person on here. I was a senior editor. Anyway, they never got it corrected. But
Oh,
I
that's a
love
gem of a story. I know which paper this is, the virtual words paper, right?
yeah.
You know how I know this paper? I was doing my first qualitative papers at the time. I was trained quantitatively and stuff. Anyways, I was looking for good templates. I was looking for good exemplar papers, for example, for how to describe your procedures. And I took that
Mhm.
paper. Know this paper. I don't know what it says, but I know it has this beautiful coding tree. Not a coding tree like we do it today, but a coding tree how we did it 10 years ago. It had that one in it. And I was like, oh, sweet. This is so well described. I'm going to use this as my template. And I'm modeling what I'm writing the same way. That's how I know your paper.
So it says Robin Teaglin,
I
actually,
know,
and she's
that was
wonderful, but
me. I know, and
yeah.
she was one of the four guest EICs, but I was assigned your paper. I'm like, no, I want my name on there because I'm very proud of that paper.
Oh.
And I just realized Kathy Arkwart, who's been on our show a couple of times,
Oh yeah,
was the
she was
associate
great.
editor. I don't even
Yes,
remember that.
she was wonderful, and she was very supportive of your
Huh.
paper, and that made a huge difference too.
Wow.
But another fun story about that paper is recently, and when I say recent, I mean within the past 2 years, I had a senior editor on my paper recommend to me and my co-authors that we consult your paper for the method.
See, that's what I
And
mean.
you should-
For the method. For the method. It was a really good people. This was a really good exemplar for grounded theorizing qualitative data analysis. It was really, really good. 2011. There weren't a great deal of great exemplar papers around at the time.
Oh, that's funny.
So, yeah, it's a good it's a good
That's so
paper.
funny that
Yeah, it's
basically,
funny.
Dorothy, you almost should have been a co-author on that paper, I think, because you really stewarded us through the process. And then
But I
here
think
you're not even.
that's when I noticed I wasn't listed as SE, because I'm like, well, this person surely realized, like, I do know that paper. Like, well, we really recommend that you should look at this paper. I'm like, I'm very familiar with that paper. And then I noticed, oh no, it actually doesn't list me. But yeah, so
Wow.
and then we did model what we did after your method there, because it was way ahead of its time. And I think you did a great job with that.
So, Dorothy, of course, we didn't bring you in to talk about Nick, although Nick likes to talk about Nick very much. But
Hey,
we brought you on, of course, because you're the editor-in-chief of the Journal of the Association for Information System, JAIS, the flagship journal of that community. And I was just, in preparing for today, I was looking up and trying to get the history of EICs right. And I noticed that the very first one, Philip Eindor, he passed away late last year, right? So somehow I missed that. Anyway, so Philip Eindor from Tel Aviv University, he founded the journal. I'm not quite sure in the late 90s. Is that correct? I think late 90s. And then we had it had a host of very, very famous people, right? Circa was in AIC at some stage, Khaled,
Calais.
Shirley Greger, and then
Super.
Supratek Saker, and you, of course. That's quite a high profile list of EICs for any journal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you know what's really cool? This is what they did, Recker. They took it from zero, like it didn't exist, to now, 20 years later, it's pretty much, I would say, so in the pecking order of, we still think MISQ, ISR are still considered the elite, but then there's always this elite, like it'll help get you tenure, but not quite in the same. But JAIS moved from being one of many, kind of second, to now it's there. And I would put it ahead of JMIS. And some people will still put it behind a JMIS, but I think JMIS has kind of stayed. So if I were to give you the pecking order of IS journals, it's gone from like part of the pack to now, it's the top 3-4 journals in our field, right? Is that fair, Dorothy, or am I being unfair?
Well, that's how I think of it too. And I mean, when JAIS first came around as a journal, I wasn't so much aware of it. And really, I'll be honest, I wasn't reading back then. And it was just, it didn't have a good look to it. And it was just purely online. And this was a little bit ahead of its time, I think, to be purely online. And I was still kind of focused on, our traditional ones. But then really, you see how over time it really shifted. I think people's attitude shifted and the quality of submissions kept increasing and the quantity as well. And I feel like it's very firmly, considered 3 is where I would place it, in the sense that if it's the only journal you publish in and it's your top school, at a top school, it won't be enough. But if you're publishing in JAIS and you also have some in the MISQ and ISR, then I think I think that the JAIS helps as well. And since I've taken over, I really wanted to get us at the same levels of ISR. I thought we could take on ISR. It may sound a little bit arrogant, but I thought we could because we have a lot of methodological diversity at JAIS, and so we can appeal to a lot of people. And I think we're getting close, and I'm real
Dorothy,
happy.
Can I tell you what I think the most brilliant thing the JAIS has? And I don't know if this is you or if this is Supra who did this, but that promise thing.
Oh, yeah, that was under me.
Option.
Yeah,
that was you.
Great idea. Yeah.
All right,
yeah.
I think that was the most brilliant thing, because I have to say, and I'm going to be really honest right now, I haven't submitted a research paper to JAIS probably in a number of years, maybe ever. In the last year and a half, I submitted 2 to JAIS. They're both published, and they both were in the Promise track. And I had 2 different experiences with Promise. So maybe, Dorothy, tell us about, and I think it's wonderful. I think it's the greatest innovation I've seen in an IS journal. Can you tell us maybe about the Promise track and why you did it?
Yeah, sure. So that came about in our editorial board meeting at ISIS Munich. And we were brainstorming, the SEs and I were brainstorming about how do we get people to, we wanted 2 things. One, we wanted, students who have 3 papers in a dissertation. We want one of their good papers right off the bat. We don't want them to first shop around other places and then send it to us 3-4 years later after it's been rejected. But we want to try to get one of those right off the bat. That's one thing. Other thing is we did want to make JAIS very attractive for papers that had gone through 2-3 rounds at MISQ and then been rejected, but they were very good papers, but they had gotten caught up in some little thing that was keeping it from going over the edge. Maybe it was a certain reviewer, an AE, but they really did have high potential and they were very good papers. And we wanted to attract people to JAIS with those papers, because I think all of us have had papers rejected at MISQ or XI or someplace, which were actually really good papers, but they got rejected, and we wanted to track those. And so we brainstormed about how to do that. And that's how this idea came about. And the actual label for it came from Daniel Chen, because we got our last. So how do we label this? Because it's not a fast track. It's something a little different. Because the idea is we want to commit to you. So after that one round that if you keep working with us and keep making the changes, it will be published. So it's just a matter of time. And
I mean, that's the coolest thing, isn't it? This is my experience. What I did is I submitted, and they were different experiences, but I literally submitted the papers. The one, the editor basically said, yes, I give you the promise. I want to see this, because I thought they were mature, done papers. I'm an editor myself. The one followed the process that you're saying. It got rejected at another journal. And it's like, we don't want to work with it anymore. We know it's a good paper. There were 3 senior people on this paper, right? It was published last year. We know it's good. We're not going to screw around. So we went to Promise, and within like a month and a half, we got a conditional accept. We had to do 1 round, then it got published. I mean, come on, it's phenomenal.
That's awesome. That's great.
The other one, we got the Promise in a month or 2, but then it took a year or so to go back and forth about 5 times at the senior editor. So in both cases, it's really nice to a month later know I'm in. I just have to work with the senior editor, negotiate, go in. And there was just the senior editor and one other person, which was really nice.
Yeah, and that's and part of it was from my experience at MISQE because that was the model there. The model there was you don't invite a paper to be revised unless you plan to ultimately get it published because we don't want to spend people's time, reviewers' time, authors' time. And so I thought, why can't we do that with academic paper? It's academic papers too, as opposed to the practice papers. And I think we can, but it all depends on the strong incoming submission. And so it does put the burden on the authors to decide, right, is this really good work? Am I really convinced? Or do I want the option that, it's maybe a reject, resubmit, and it's really not as best I can do? And I think for the most part, it is successful in getting people to, self-identify early on that, this is a project. They're committed to it. They're convinced it's good work. And so I love those. I've handled several as SE, and I've been quite happy with how those have gone too. Every once in a while, we have a mistake where the SE doesn't notice it was submitted at promise, and then it gets the standard 3 reviews and mixed. And they, every once in a while, that has happened. Not much, but a couple of times, I think. But in general, they've gone pretty well.
Dorothy, I mean, the danger, I mean, I can see a couple of naysayers already saying like, well, this is going to make people try to exploit that, sort of like, oh, that could be a cheap shot at a quick win publication, right? Is that even happening?
Oh, not at all. There's very few promise submissions. So people are good at knowing ahead of time. Wait, I don't think this is mature enough to take that risk because, there is no, so many papers. I hate it when you get a review packet and this is a major risky revision. I'm like, come on. I mean, tell me authors it's risky. Then you're like, do you put your all into it or do you not? Because it's so risky. And what happens, and so I don't like that language very much. But I think we've gotten very conditioned to it. And so we ourselves realize, well, okay, so would I rather have the opportunity for a major risky revision or just an outright reject? Because there is no major risky revision with promise. It's like, no, there's no,
It's either conditional, accept, or reject.
Yeah.
Right? So you have to be really confident.
Conditional accept with a major revision, whatever. But you're committing. There's that promise. That's why it's the promise. And so if you as an SE think, I'm not sure, they need more data, and I'm not sure if it's going to work, then you're bound to reject it. You have to, because you have to be able to say, if they do this, we are going to get it in. And so I think it's worked with the papers that have gone through it. It's worked pretty well. And I do think the acceptance rate is higher on those papers, but it's because they're better coming in.
Yeah. Well, that's fair enough.
Does that hurt you as a journal editor at all, having a higher acceptance rate, like in these metrics and various things, or no?
Oh, no, because the overall acceptance rate, I think, is like 6% or so. But for the promise papers, it's just those papers. There's very few. I think there's probably only 5 or 6 a year coming in right now as promise. And maybe people aren't confident enough, or I don't know.
I think it's a similar thing with everything that's not a research article. It's the same with the quarterly, where you look at how many research note submissions do you get, how many theory and review, how many of these different categories do you get that is not a research article, and it's always few. Even the quarterly gets like 10 theory and review papers a year and like 20 research notes. And most of the research notes that get published are actually downgraded.
When they start out, they're downgraded.
I'm putting them in quotation marks here that you can't hear, folks, I think. But anyway, you're right. So they sort of they convert it into a research note. They're not actually being submitted as a research note. As an editor, I think I've had an 1 or 2 research notes in the last 8 years. So, so people, I think there's still this perception that if it's not a proper research article, if it doesn't go through 3 rounds of really hardcore review with at least 5 people commenting on it, then it doesn't count. And in fact, in some of the rankings, they literally don't count them. It's a funny thing. Like, for example, editorials don't count as a paper for some weird reasons. They're being reviewed. You've put several years of hard work into it. So from all sorts of viewpoints, they're very important papers. But for some reason, and for some people, research note counts less. And I'm pretty sure that people will say, a policy paper counts less or a promise paper counts less. Why? Just because I don't know, So I do think that plays into it, that people say like, oh, I want to make sure that I have a research article because that's what I'm supposed to be doing.
But it's still called a research article. So no one knows that it's a promise paper once it's been published. Yeah. But I will say you're right about, like, when you look at the download statistics at JAIS, the editorials and research perspectives are downloaded way higher than research papers. The literature reviews get downloaded very well. And we do get a strong number of literature reviews being submitted every year. Fewer pure theory papers are being submitted. But the for whatever reason, and editorials and the research perspectives papers.
So Dorothy, I will tell you this, as much as I love the promise, and we wanted to get John King on to talk to him about his policy papers. Policy
editorials,
and here's my point about policy papers is that the last person I want creating policy for anything is an IS researcher. Okay? I know IS researchers. I am an IS researcher. They should not be creating any kind of policy. Now, granted, the people who make policy shouldn't be creating policy, but we definitely shouldn't.
So let me talk about this. So because I did one of these, with Rick Watson and our friend,
case in point,
environmental one, yeah,
and Wolf Ketter, we wrote a JIS policy paper that John King handled on energy policy, and digital mirror action and so forth. So the point, I think, for us as authors is not that we're saying, look, policymakers go do this. The point is more that having that published in a reputable academic journal has a signaling effect. So what we actually did is we waited till this was out and said, here's a reviewed scientific article, blah, 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 on this idea. Now we took this and we went to the entire policymakers that are in the different gremiums in the US and in Europe and contacted every single one of them and said, like, here's what we think about policymaking. By the way, here's, our article on this and et cetera and so forth. This is input. This is not a policy. This is just input of things that you should be considering. It comes with a signal of academic reputation and sort of, like sciencey stuff, which is easy to signal if you have that paper to it. We didn't mention that, by the way, this is from a journal that has a policy section and it's called a policy paper. Not at all. It's more like, hey, here's a bunch of guys, we do research on this stuff that has policy relevant implications. We wrote a paper, wait till it get published, and here it is. Now, the next question is, of course, then how many of these different representatives and senators and everybody else even responded to us? Very, very few. So out of 200, I think 3 that said something like, thank you for your email and we'll consider it or something. So these sort of translational processes are a completely different ballgame. But the point is more that I fully agree with Nick that policymakers don't read and shouldn't read, and maybe we shouldn't make policy. That doesn't mean that this entire idea is nonsense. You just have to take that extra step and the extra mile.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that those policy editorials is less about creating policy or even suggesting what policy should be as opposed to providing input on what policies are needed. And yeah, I think they've been very interesting. I loved y'all's on energy, Dick Mason's on the data privacy. The recent one on facial recognition technology I thought was great. And so just really interesting and it's a space that we have not been in as IS researchers. And it would be nice if we, had at least some voice in the policy agenda setting. So maybe not so much the policies themselves, but the policy agenda setting. But that would require also that AIS somehow provide a bridge between the journal and relevant, government and other organizations, which it may happen in the future. Certainly it's not on the table right now because they're stretched thin.
So let's say I did have some opinion, right? And it's a socio-technical issue. If I just wrote 4 or 5 pages of that opinion, send it to John King, he'd publish it? Like,
I think first you tell him what your thoughts are, what topic you're interested in, and see if he thinks it's a good topic for a policy editorial. And then once you get a draft together, he goes back and forth a couple times with authors. And when he's happy with it, then he sends it to he calls it a posse of reviewers. And then they give comments. Then it comes to me. And a lot of times they go back and forth another couple times with me. And they go through a pretty rigorous process. And we try to keep him, I know his vision is keep him short and focused, which I like. I think any editorial that goes over 5,000 words, I think is kind of getting into territory where it's no longer really an editorial. It's just kind of keep it focused and keep it crisp. Yeah, I've been happy with those too. It's an innovative section, and he started that right before I joined as EIC, and I'm happy that he's given it he did it 3 years and he's given it another term to try to see how far he can kind of push that section.
So, Dorothy, I wanted to test the folk theory here. My folk theory at the moment is that when I look at you implemented a few innovations, right? The policy section, the promise review. You have a lot more editorials now. Every issue, it seems you have an editorial on how to write better and how to handle revisions. And and what's the theoretical contribution, how to write certain types of papers like theory papers and so forth. And my folk theory is, I thought what you're doing is you're trying to model JIS a little bit on AMR to occupy the theory journal space in the IS field. It looked like it to me. Now, that's what I mean. It's a folk theory. It's just, it looks like this. And I wanted to ask you about it, whether that is whether that's a wrong impression or whether I'm onto something here. Yeah, it looked to me that you're being very strategic and that you look to occupy this particular niche where JS already has a history. It has some very interesting theory papers. You could, in my experience, you could always send conceptual theory-only papers to JIS, which has always been one of the big plus points for that journal. And that you took that and said, okay, let's occupy, let's own this space of theory papers. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's a fair characterization. So when I started as EIC, instead of coming in and thinking, oh, let's kind of radically transform this journal, I thought, let's build on the strengths. And the strengths is definitely the theory space for JIS. It had the theory workshop that it had for many, many years at IS.
Exactly.
And always had this emphasis that we are committed to theory at JAIS. No matter how much great data you bring in, we still expect a theory element. Thought, well, rather than trying to go away from that, let's build on that. So we now have the pure theory section, kind of divorcing that from literature reviews, just an AMR style theory paper that Robert Gregory is the SC of that section. And we're not getting a lot of submissions there yet. We're trying to encourage them. We're having these editorial series, I call them, like special issues worth of editorials. We have 3 on theorizing, and I just have a new submission in that would kind of fit in the theorizing space. We have the ones on writing. So Eric Baird, Sherry Kane's, mine and Monica's. And then in this next issue that's coming up, it'll go live probably next week. Nice editorial by Min-Sik Pang and Jason Thatcher on writing revisions and writing response documents. And then with that, we're kicking off a series, I call them backstories. So there'll be backstory editorials where we'll have authors of JAIS papers that have gone through, a good review process, and that they will write the story of the review that they went through, kind of their journey getting that paper published. So you, like in a seminar, PhD seminar, you can have the actual published paper, then you can have this backstory editorial that walks through the original did this, but then we had to do all this and this and this. And I want to have one representing kind of every major method. So the first one coming out is actually one I did with some co-authors, and it uses a case study. And then the next one that I'm working with some authors on that they're writing up, I was the SC of their paper. It's a pure theory paper. And then I want to get one that uses panel data, one that does online experimentation, one that's a survey. Yeah, so people can kind of see those papers go through so many. So yeah, we have a couple of editorial series as I call them. And I have tried to, at the beginning of my term, I didn't really think so much about editorials, but I realized, that's a great opportunity to put some interesting things that people don't normally get to talk about in papers. And so we're trying to get interesting ones coming out. We have a great editorial in this issue coming out next week from Franz Rowe and Lynn Marcus that talks a lot about digital transformation and the need for coherency and consistency in language and terminology so that we can actually develop that stream of research in a coherent manner. It's a really neat one coming out. So, but yeah, the emphasis on theory has been deliberate, and I'm really hoping JAIS can take ownership of pure theory papers and be the first place people want to go when they're writing pure theory.
That would be cool.
Very happy to see.
I think that's exactly fun. Like, so Nick said he didn't actually submit many papers, right? In the early years, you said that, right? Until a couple of years ago. For me, it was very different, right? Because I don't come out of that particular top school North American system. So, for example, my very first paper was in JIS, and I think this is the journal where I've submitted most of my papers. So, in my experience, it was always, I gotta say, the review process were always great in the sense that there were some outlier experience where it took a little bit too long and stuff like this. Sure. But by and large, as opposed to many of the other journals, most of the review process were always within 2 to 3 rounds. 2 to 3 rounds, done. Be done with this. The other aspect that I really loved about them is I'm not sure you still operate this way, but for a long time it was SE and reviewers, no AE. And I like this slim approach because it just eliminates an entire layer where everyone feels obliged to put their own 4 or 5 pages of extra comments to it. So if you take that out, it's just a lot less. I have a lot of papers where as an SE, and there's 2 or 3, not necessarily 3 or more, but sometimes only 2 reviewers, and just that's a package of 8 pages, and that's just literally half of the standard package. I sent out a package yesterday as an SE, 15 pages long. That's usually what you give to authors, 15 pages, and then they respond with a 40-page paper and a 50-page response again. So we're blowing everything up, right? So I always like this, that it was a little bit leaner in JS. And the third thing I wanted to say, and you can comment on this, is it also felt for a long time that it had, for particular niches or particular genres, there was a safe bet to go. For example, I would think that a lot of the design science scholars, for a long time, they would feel, wow, JIS is our top outlet because they will readily, or let's say more readily, welcome these papers. And they did publish more of these. Now, maybe that's because Shirley was an editor for a long time or something, but that was certainly an area. So in my area, in systems analysis and design, JIS was also always a top outlet because this was a reputable, good outlet that would actually publish these things. So I think a lot of people felt very welcome, as I said, the pure conceptual papers. The JS was always a key place for them. If you were, like me, in a system where for all ranking and P&T decision matters, it was literally just ranked at the top, where we didn't have that super elite hierarchy with 2 very, very top and then another layer and another layer and another layer. In Australia, we had 4 or 5 A journals or something, and JS was one of them, simple. And if you happen to be in one of these genres, then that was a very welcome choice. Where, in fact, for example, I would send my first papers in PhD straight off the bat to JIS, not as an afterthought, and after it was rejected. So a very different experience, I guess. And that's continued to this day. I always have some JIS paper under review, I think.
Yeah, so we did introduce AEs at JIS, but it's very different than the traditional AE model at in MySQISR and other places. So our AEs are, you won't even know as an author which of those reviews is from the AE unless the SE tells you. But it's the way that the SEs do like to have an AE presence as a reviewing on papers, because that'll be like your most senior reviewer on the paper, and as the SE, you know that. And then sometimes I feel like what's happened in our field is, part of the reason some review packages have 4 reviews is because SEs are asking 4 people, anticipating that 2 are going to turn it down, and they want to have at least 2 reviews ready to go, so they invite 4, sometimes even more. And then in the rare case, all 4 provide a review, you've got way too much feedback, because the reality is you only need 2 good reviews.
That's what I think as well, yeah.
And so in hope of getting 2 good reviews, we're asking 4 people to actually review it. So if we could just agree as a field, if I am going to do a review, I will give a good review, then we would only need 2 per paper, in my opinion.
Yeah, I fully agree with that.
Yeah, the AEs form a great role at JIS too, where if you've got a paper and a reviewer hasn't responded and you need kind of a quick turnaround, then the AEs are typically there to jump in. And then they also handle the promise papers, because those are only reviewed by associate editors, just unless there's nobody with the right expertise.
Oh, I didn't even know that. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's one of the roles of the AE is to handle the promise papers, because we want those to go through quickly
with the SE. So it's 2
Yeah.
people. Yeah. So this is the argument for more reviewers and an AE though, and I think it's the apprenticeship program, right? So I think maybe Arun Rai explained this to me with MISQ, is that, really the problem that we have is that senior editors are like rubber stampers and AEs are often the actual senior editors,
Right.
studying the pen. But it shouldn't be that way. But what you should be doing as an AE is learning from the SE so that you can one day be an SE. That's the apprenticeship. And then that's another reason for adding a 3rd or maybe 4th reviewer is, you get a couple reviewers who you want to review the paper. And then you add a person or 2 who maybe is a bit more junior, not as experienced, and you give them, because not only do they go through the practice of reviewing, but they see the rest of the review packet. And I know when I was junior, I would always compare myself to other reviewers to see how I nailed it compared to them. And then I would look at this editor to see which reviewer comments there. Of course, I don't do this anymore.
I still do that. Absolutely.
Yeah. Back in the day, I would totally do that to kind of gauge how am I doing. And I would get really happy if the editor took my comments and ran, right? So I think as an apprenticeship model, because it's really what we are. We're like carpenters crafting papers, right? And just like carpenters, there's an embodied, a practice oriented element to this that you get by, I think, in the review process. I think my experience in the review process made me a much better author, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. No question. I mean, not about you, but in general, right? Reviewer and editor roles make you a better scientist and a better writer and a better everything. And it's only because we have these feedback mechanisms that, for example, the reviewers now, by default in most journals, actually get to see the decision letters. Right. I don't know whether there's any journal still not doing that. If they are, they got to change that. Everyone should see what the outcome was of that effort that they put in, even if they were a reviewer too or something. Absolutely.
Yeah, and hopefully they read it, because that's the key. Like you spent the time, and I did too, as a junior professor. I always wanted to see the review packet, what other people said, was I consistent with other people, and what the SE said. But if the reviewers aren't actually reading those, if they're too busy and they feel like they're reviewing so much they don't need to bother, then yeah, they're missing the learning loop there, in which case they're not actually going to improve.
What I still do, I mean, as I said, I still read them to this day. And what I actually do, I actually save that email with the decision letter in the folder where I saved my review. So that in case, for example, when it comes back, I'll actually look, okay, what did I say? What was the letter again? Like, like a year later. So anyway, so little things, but I do think that kind of helps people to learn. I'm going to shift a little bit again, Dorothy. I mentioned this to Nick mentioned this actually. He said, like, look, we have all these people asking us, can you talk more about publishing? I'm like, wow, we had like 27 episodes on publishing and how to get published and so forth. But this always keeps coming up. And now it's a great opportunity, of course, because you as an EIC, you literally get to see every paper that comes through, the ones that make it and the 90% or 95% of papers that don't make it, plus all the review packages. So I wondered if you developed some sort of knack for spotting things early. Like can you see when a paper comes in, can you spot and say, like, that's got to be a outright reject, or, oh, this is an interesting one? And if so, of course, can you talk a little bit about, what early indicators are there to see whether this looks like an interesting paper before you even assign it to an editor, or whether you already think, oh, that's not going to fly? Is there such a thing, like an early warning signal?
Yeah, because so I look through all the introductions. First thing I do with papers come in, and honestly, if I can look through an abstract and read an introduction and still really not have an idea what the paper's about, that's a really bad sign. And so that paper probably head toward the death reject. So you have to be able to make a case, especially in your introduction, that by the end of it, someone who's not totally familiar with your topic may not even be interested. You still have to make the case. This is what you're doing. This is why you're doing it. And this is why it's important. And you got to be able to communicate that in your introduction. Because if you can get through that and you're still thinking, then what are they studying? Then you start kind of skimming through the rest, and it's really on it. Then it's got a big uphill battle to face if it even is going to go into.
So before you can give more information than just the abstract, I do have a trick I've been trying to do lately with abstracts, and tell me what you think of this. If you look at least the way I did abstracts for much of my career, and many of the abstracts that I see, it's basically a microcosm of the paper. The first sentence or two, they're motivating. Middle sentence or two, they're making the fourth, fifth, sixth sentence, right? They're talking about the study. And then in the last sentence, they talk about their conclusions. I think a better abstract is to skip the motivation. You motivate in the intro, you motivate in your paper. Yeah. You don't need to motivate in the abstract. Just get to we studied, 30 firms in this industry, and we found this, this, and this. And then if you want to talk about why it's important, then in the last sentence, you say, what this does is, addresses the inconsistency in the literature, right? So that's rather than the motivation, you make it the contribution. And then you don't spend most of the abstract motivating your paper, because then you get to the intro and it's a total, it's redoing the abstract again, sometimes the same words.
Yeah, I don't like abstracts that try to just summarize the whole paper, and basically then you read it, you'll see the abstract again in the introduction. Yeah, just tell me the abstract.
That's an obvious one. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you guys like my idea? I've been doing this. Do you both do that?
And I don't even like long abstracts. I just want short focus abstracts. And mainly in the abstract, what you're looking for is what type of paper, what kind of method is it? What kind of data do they have? And that's what I look for.
What are your findings?
Yeah, I don't get motivated by the abstract, but certainly the introduction, you want to, if you get the introduction, you can't even find the research question or the research objective that's clearly stated, and that's never a good sign. And I feel like there are papers that are submitted prematurely, so people, well, we'll just go ahead and get feedback. We know it's not great yet. Let's go ahead and get feedback. But I think that's a mistake, because until you've really polished it and you've gotten feedback from other people and polished it, the feedback you're going to get is not going to be nearly as helpful if it comes in a state that should not have been submitted yet. And so I'm trying to just politely desk reject those, just to save author time, save reviewer time, save SE time on the papers that have the most potential. So my goal always is an EIC, kind of everywhere I've been, it's always been that I want a high acceptance rate of the papers that go into review. So I
like that.
Try to screen out, and I may make some mistakes with some desk rejects, but still, you're better off getting a desk reject in a week's time than going through 4 or 5 months and getting a rejection. Then you just are. And so, and then once it gets to review, my hope is that there's kind of a very low rejection rate of papers that make it into review. Some will still get rejected, and then the longer they're in review, the lower you want the chance to be of being rejected.
Yeah, I think that also preserves reviewers, right? We have so many reviewers. It's almost at this point a request to review something once a day, somewhere, somehow.
Oh my
God.
Wow.
And it's like, it's crazy. So I have to, and the fact is, reviewers are so overwhelmed that it's like, we want to preserve them and just send them the papers where we actually need their review. Yeah.
Exactly.
And then you mentioned research questions, Dorothy. So which research question I always like, there's a framing I look for in a research question that always bothers me. And it's like, how can we? All right. Right. They say, how can we design a such and such? How can we right? It's like, how can we? Well, we can't, whatever the answer is to how can we, there are 30 answers, right? It's not how it's how, I don't know what the appropriate answer is, but if you're looking for a descriptive study, how can we is always a horrible research question.
I actually prefer, my preference is research objectives more than questions.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of the you have to state an explicit research question. I think that's also, that is not a one size fits every paper kind of thing. Right. Like if it's a good research question, put it in, but otherwise I don't think people need to feel obliged to put in explicitly stated research questions.
Me neither. I actually prefer the research objectives. Our objectives is to better understand blah, 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 blah. The thing with research questions, it's always bothered me this, if it's qualitative, you have to have a how or why question. I'm like, give me any how or why question and I can convert it to a what question. And so it's just a matter of it's just a matter of terminology. And then sometimes you'll get like a series of 3 very specific research questions, and each one is really tied to a specific hypothesis, and it's too mechanical that way.
I hate that too.
I just want the overall research objective. Yeah.
I love what you said about the how and why, because I never understood that advice. Because the how and why, you can always reformulate a question as a how or a why, or it's just change the wording. So I never understood that advice at all. It just didn't work. Well,
you know where it comes from, though, right? It comes from the 90s, big qualitative. Yeah, exactly. It comes from the big qualitative textbooks, the Yin book, especially. I don't know whether in the later version it did this, but the 90s version, he certainly did. Look, if you have a what question, that's a survey. If you have a how and why, that's a qualitative. And so people learned that, if you have a qualitative paper, you have to have a how and why question. End of story. And econometrics people would take objections to that too, I think. If we
I mean, what's the relationship between generative AI and knowledge creation? Or you could say, how is generated AI related to? I mean, it's the same question. And so it always bugged me that we force people, and then the questions they just get real mechanical. And I mean, the worst kind of questions start with do. Does or do this. It's like, well, that's a yes, no question. And do you really need to ask the answer as to I can tell you right now the answer is yes.
Well, what if it's does whatever alignment
does
affect
trust lead
performance?
To user satisfaction? Yeah, exactly.
Well, then it's a yes, no. I mean, then it's a yes, no, and I think most people look at the question and say, well, yes.
All right. So these are the things that don't work, right? So the what not to do kind of things that we said, right? So abstract research question, introduction. The way that I sometimes put it, I sometimes get the feeling that the introductions are written by people that are so deep in the tunnel view of the little microcosm that they can't possibly fathom that no one knows what they're talking about. I'll give you one example. Platforms. If you're not into platforms, most papers don't tell me what the bloody hell a platform is. And if you don't know what that is, then none of the rest makes sense. And I don't know what platform orchestration is. You got to tell me. So I sometimes think it has a very easy fix. Just give it to someone to read. That's not your bloody author team. Just give it to someone else that has no idea what a platform is. And if they understand your first page, then it's probably a good first page. Yeah. So I think sometimes people just throw jargon and concepts at you, expecting you to be in this conversation to know what all these different concepts mean. The reality is 99% of your readers and your reviewers will not be, and we got to help them, right?
Yeah. It was interesting at Hicks, we had a JAIS Hicks workshop on writing, and the second half of the workshop, we had people bring in introductions, and they'd sit at a table and they'd swap introductions and read each other's introductions and kind of do a think aloud. This is what I'm thinking when I'm reading your introduction. It's really interesting now when someone who's like totally unrelated to your topics, not picked for any reason, is reading, and it's like, okay, I see what you're saying here, but this is not making sense. And how did you get here? And yeah, people really enjoyed the exercise, and it was really useful. And I think I think your advice is, well taken.
It's an easy one, right? You can just send it to, go next door to your colleague who's probably going to do something different from you. Just say, can you look at my first page? And you'll get an answer tomorrow, and he'll tell you, look, this flow doesn't work, and this paragraph doesn't work, and I don't know what this term is. And you have 4 or 5 simple fixes that will literally make your first page better. And because otherwise, I totally agree with you, Dorothy. I think this first impression is so important. As an editor, you get this email, you've been assigned a paper, and it has, the title, it has the abstract, not even the introduction. So you do it and you click, and then chances are the paper is going to lose me at the end of these first 5 minutes where I've gone through the abstract introduction. And it has done a poor job then I'm really already annoyed, because then it looks like just more work. Yeah. And then the other 39 pages really have to turn this initial impression around. As opposed to if it's a crystal clear abstract, looks interesting. Oh, that's an interesting data set, or this is an interesting approach, or whatever. And the first introduction is clear in what it tries to do, what question or objective it tries to meet. Then, okay, I'm keeping reading. And all of a sudden, I'm not annoyed anymore, because now I'm interested and I want to read this paper. And so anyway, so I do think this first impression matters, and it matters a lot in how accessible. What did you say last time, Nick? User-friendly. How user-friendly that is. I think user-friendliness is big. Yeah, and maybe not in the final paper, but certainly in handling your
unless you're French. If you're French, then it's bad, because you need to be obfuscatory so that people can understand the depth of your thinking. Mike, can I say that?
I wanted to ask, what are the signs for great papers? Can we spot great papers early on? Is that a thing, or are we just gonna, did you have papers that you handled that you saw coming through where initially you thought, oh my God, that's a really good one, I'm going to make sure I'm going to send it to this really, this editor and make sure that we get it through or something? Is that even a thing that happens?
Yeah, I think it's a thing that happens. And I think, realistically, just as a community, we don't produce a lot of great papers. And as individuals, we hope we have a few great papers maybe in our career. And not every paper is going to be like a really great paper. But when you see them, I think you notice those right away. One thing is they're extremely well written, and they're like beautiful to read, and you enjoy reading them. And then it's just something that you would have never thought about. And so, just makes you think, as I call them, kind of voila, you've got some kind of voila moment that happens, as wow, I would have never thought about this. And we've had some of those. I still love it. Demetrius's, and I think it was Alan Lee was the second.
And Alan Lee, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, this paper. I loved that paper, and it just really made me think totally different than I would have thought before I'd read it. And those are jewels, and getting papers like that are just real jewels. Sometimes it's because the topic is so extraordinary that you wouldn't have even thought of doing a paper on that topic. And then everything else is also well done. The data's great and the theorizing's great, but the topic itself is something like, oh, wow, I would have never thought of that. And that was like the child exploitation, child sexual, and that one was really a well done paper. The method is great, and the data is troubling, very troubling. It was like, wow, I would have never thought to do that paper. And so I loved, you love reading it for that reason. And they're not always like the heavy research papers. There's one I love in the last issue or 2 issues ago that they looked at Australian bank that was developing an algorithm to predict gambling habits. And then they took ethical lenses, the 3 major ethical lenses: utilitarianism, deontology, and value-based. and interpreted it from the three ethical perspectives. I thought it was a great paper and really enjoyed reading that one. So yeah, you get these papers where, for me, if I read it and I can get through the whole paper without feeling I need to take a break, because and it's a good paper and I'm excited, for those.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I don't think as a community we can expect every paper that we publish in any particular journal to be great. I mean, I was just thumbing through yesterday the MISQ table of contents because I was very specifically wanting to find a recently published case study. And I mean, I was going back through several issues and none of them I know I was just kind of looking at titles, but based on the titles, I could kind of tell like titles and authors, which ones were case. I was just shocked how few there were. And I really had to dig until I found one. But yeah, so I think we're going to produce a lot of papers that are heavy empirics and they're very focused and they've got a clear research question and a couple hypotheses and grade they support or not. But the ones that really challenge your thinking are going to be fewer, and that's fine because we don't have the absorptive capacity to be challenged massively,
all the time.
Yeah, and so that's kind of how it should be.
You mentioned one thing, Dorothy, and that's theory papers and how you'd like to see more of those. You don't get them. And I always think a good theory paper is rooted in a review of the literature, right? It's almost like people think that you have reviews, these structured reviews where they just boringly tell us about the literature, right? And that's like how not to do a review. Just tell me how many papers there were that talked about this, how many papers there were that talked about that. That's horrible. That no one wants to read that. The trick is to organize it in such a way that you have some assertions at the end. And you don't just categorize the papers, but you take the meaning. And the fact is, you're a master at this, right? I mean, some of your most well-known papers were kind of theory development with a review of the literature. And you want this theory development in JAIS. I always argue for attention to the cumulative tradition. If you were to, and I also think that theory papers are always the highest risk, right? Yes. Because you don't have data to fall back on. Right. So what's the advice? How do you get a theory paper? Because everything has already been said, hasn't it? So how do you publish a theory paper? How do I get my theory paper accepted at JAIS?
Yeah, so there's a lot, first starting on the review side. So I agree that theory comes from review of the literature. The problem that we've had now as a discipline, from my perspective with review papers, is we've got now all these guidelines and how you're supposed to do the review. And so by the time you follow all these guidelines, it itself has become a very kind of mechanized process, and the insights.
They're bad guidelines.
Can we say this out loud? Systematic literature review, structured literature review has been a disservice to the field. I want to say this loud and clear. It's like, I know the guys said that
bad guidelines,
but it's bad. Don't do this. People, don't follow this. This is not the way to engage with the cumulative tradition. We structurally followed all this and we scan all the abstract and blah. Nah, absolutely not.
Yeah, and I've always thought of it as, I mean, you look at sometimes, people, when they review literature, they tell other people, they write all about what's been done. And then sometimes they'll write about what's been found. And that's already better than writing about what's been done. We really don't need to know what's been done. All right. It's only important what people found, not what they did. But then that's not important enough either, just to tell us what's been found. You got to give us your insights into what that means. Not the insights the authors talk about in their own paper, but your insights when you look at this comprehensive body of work together. What does it tell you? And so you always need to push it to your insights. And if you don't get it to that level, then they're very boring to read.
All right, Dorothy, what you just said is brilliant. All right. You said these structured literature reviews that Recker and I both hate, that I get all the time in like conferences, like at Hicks and at AOM, where I'm running things. I get a bunch of these and yeah, they're bad. They just tell you what has been done, you said. Right. So that what has been done, no one wants to read that. It's boring. So then the next step, you said, is what has been found. That's at least a little better, isn't it? It's not just what has been done, but what are our findings? You're kind of aggregating findings, maybe showing, what do we know, and kind of so that's at least better. And maybe if that's as far as you get, you can publish it someplace, and at least we have some category. But then what you said is the key to a theoretical contribution is, what does it mean? I love it. What are you talking about? How do I go from what has been found to what does it mean? That's so cool. But give me my formula. How do I do that?
Yeah, well, so I'll never give anybody a formula or guidelines on anything because I think they're too dangerous. But I keep spreadsheets and I'll have every paper recorded. And then for certain papers, I'll have an idea that comes into my head. Oh, all right. So then here's this insight that I come up with based on what I've been reading so far. So it's always coming up. And if you can yourself come, 3 or 4 unique insights that you're developing as you read through it. It's not going to come from one paper. It may be that one paper triggers it because you've already read so many others. So it's not that every paper is going to give you something to think about, but you're looking for something insightful that you only have thought about because you've read this collection of papers.
So it's a construction. You have to construct something new. And that new thing you're constructing is not just opportunities for future research, right? Because even if they get to the point where something has been found, then they have to have that boring table about, these are the things future research should do. What you're saying is there's something in between. There's a construction, an abductive act, an imaginative act. And maybe, and I don't know, one trick to doing that is draw on a conceptual tradition for the language. And that, like, you might, or.
I mean, it's like when you're doing qualitative research where, you're coming up with a new construct that you've come up with based on all these interviews. I always go back when I'm thinking, these constructs, what's an example of a new construct? Well, like the emotional labor, I thought that was just a brilliant one when that came out, that they came up with this term emotional labor to explain so much of what nurses were doing. It wasn't the physical labor, it was actually this emotional labor. And they came up with a definite name for it. And it was from interviewing all of these nurses to figure out what they're doing during the day. And they're checking this box and taking temperatures and administering medications and all this stuff. But what they're really doing is administering emotionally to patients, or at least part of what they're really important part of what they're really doing that doesn't get measured with IT is this emotional labor.
And then you would reframe those findings you find with this lens, and then you're creating, right? You're bringing you're bringing what people have found. You're bringing this new lens of emotion. You're reformulating some kind of knowledge in that domain. And now you're making a theoretical contribution. Right.
Now we can reinterpret what we knew before. And so with the theory papers, and some of them will be much bigger and broader and higher levels. Some will be much narrow. And I think as a field, we need both, right? But that's what we're always pushing for, is to think, just to have those new insights that you wouldn't have had if you wouldn't have read all that. But and that's why I don't like the mechanical guidelines, because you can read and I can read and we can all read the same body of literature, but we'll come up with different insights. And so no matter how much we code and we agree on we're going to code it this way, that's all irrelevant unless we're only coding for what's been done and what's been found. Because the minute we start to try to think, all right, so what does that mean, and where do I go from here? That's when our own backgrounds and all the other literature we've read unrelated is going to influence what we're thinking, all the theories we're exposed to. So you can never have that replicable.
So guys, I'm listening here with interest. So to me, it looks like I think we have fewer theorists in the field than we had in the past. So it just, I don't know, it's my impression. So that we have less theory and review papers. Everyone knows your very famous 2001, I think, paper, right? Anyway, so we've had these people. We have less of them, right? Do we have a theory paper in every issue of the top journals? I don't think so, right? No. And I think one of the reasons for this is that we've been training a lot of empiricists and methodologists. We have very strong people in these areas. They're really good with empirics. They're really good with data. We have data everywhere. And we have a strong emphasis and rigor and stuff like this. So with that, you can't be good at everything very often, right? So with that, we don't have people that are necessarily very good at this imagination that you guys talked about, this disciplined imagination. Because I think there's actually two aspects to this. One of them is this sort of constructing meaning out of something, this imaginary part. But I always think in theory development work, there's also discipline to it. Yeah. So when I look at theory papers, and I do get them, and when I handle them, they're just poorly done. They're not well defined. They're
not focused, a bunch of tangents. They're showing what they read rather than
exactly. But also they don't clearly define their constructs. They don't tell me how that construct relates to other constructs. They don't differentiate. They don't give me an example. They don't back it up. Like this is what I think always is the discipline imagination. So like there is not rigor. There's not a procedure. There's no template, but there is discipline to theory development work. For example, how careful to define your construct. If you come up with a new construct, you got to be careful there, right?
Wrecker, if people don't know what you're talking about when you say disciplined imagination, there's this famous Weick paper, right? Exactly. Where he talked about theorizing as disciplined imagination, which I love, right? Weick is wonderful. Everyone should read as much Weick as they can get a hold of because, and then realize that you'll never be Weick. I think Europeans in particular want to be Weick. They want to be Chibora. They want to be Latour, right? And these are such clever, artful writers. And the problem is, if we try to be them, we can't because we suck, right? We're very so. What we have to do is it takes what they do as inspiration, and then try to do our more mundane version of them, right?
We have different views on that, Nick. That's okay.
But I think part of it that we don't have so much is the risk, like Nick had mentioned earlier, the risky papers to write. Part of the reason they're risky is if it is rejected from like JIS or MISQ, where do you go? Well, if it's rejected at MISQ, you may come to JIS, and if it's rejected from JIS, where do you take your theory paper? Because there's not a lot of places it publishes, so that's a problem. I think the other risk, though, is that if we're getting reviewers who are empirical people, I think some of these can look at a theory paper and think, oh, that was easy to do. That's not, I mean, anyone can come up with that. And actually, that's why part of the reason we did these editorial series on theorizing, because it's not the case at all that it's easy to do, but you may read it, and by the time it's gotten all laid out there, it looks obvious, and oh, that was not nearly as rigorous as all my stuff with data. And so that's a mistake. But then the other thing is, I think we apply Baccarat's criteria for falsifiability and too much to theories where it doesn't apply to. So that applies to, I consider it for mid-range theories, where the idea is you're going to test it. So then all of a sudden this validity stuff and the falsifiability is important. But if you're doing higher level theory, it's not about falsifiability anymore. That's not the criteria. The criteria is, does this cover a broad range? It should cover a broad range. If it's the broader, the better. It should be simple. If it's too complex and you haven't worked out it into a coherent state yourself yet, so you need to work it out coherently. So we need to understand that different types of theory have different criteria for what we should look for as readers. And so until we have the reviewers that are able to kind of see the gem in these and help nurture them along, then it's also hard to get them published. So we do need, and I think there's enough younger people coming through who are interested in working on theory, and then we'll start getting enough massive reviewers who can look at these and say, oh, wow, I do see something in that, and guide the authors to get them successfully published, because I do think they're great papers. I find them so interesting to read. But you're right, if it's not done well, then this really...
and they're cited a lot. And I have to say, Dorothy, that this is the funny thing. What you said is what people say and what I've thought. And then on the editorial side, you see the other side of these things. People see the theory papers that somehow make it through, and they think, oh, that's easy, or that's a bad theory paper, or they have whatever, and they're not impressed with what comes out. And they're like, I can do that. So they do their version. What they don't see is in the background, for every one that through some accident of fortune makes it through, there are 90 that get rejected because nothing new, sloppy thinking, and whatever. You can always reject a theory paper. So I think that's an issue. But listen, Wrecker, we're running up on time here. What should we do? I think there are so many wonderful things about this talk, but my favorite thing that Dorothy kind of gave was this idea of how to do a review. And it's like, what's been done? That's lame. What we found, that's better. And what it means, that's the hard part, right? And that's pretty cool. I love that. I'm going to use that from now on.
Well, like for a dissertation, I mean, the students, they need to do the review, and they need to find out what's been done to help justify their question. They need to find out what's been found. And it's only when you get to the stage of you're writing a lit review of, standalone literature review or a theory paper that then you move on. You got to move on to that next step to make it work.
Well, I think what I take away is I'm not sure to what extent some of these initiatives have been very popular or very broadly known, but I think the picture that he portrayed of JIS is one that is very rich, very diverse, lots of different options for authors beyond having a great empirical paper. You can send all empirical papers there, but you can, you welcome theory papers, you welcome policy papers, you have these promise review options. You have an interesting model that involves DAEs. So all of that makes that journal a very interesting space, which, by the way, I think is just very simply plain and great to see. I always was if we have a home association, AIS, if that is our main association, our top journal has to be really top. There's no other way. Otherwise, our entire community, it's sort of is looking ridiculous. Yeah, if we take ourselves seriously, then the journal that's the flagship, and that is JAIS, has to be super, super good. And the one thing, if I may say this, the one area where that really freaking still annoys me is that the web page still looks like from 1993 and runs on AOL.com. I mean, it's nice that it was the first digital journal, but seriously, come on. Yeah. And I know how it works. I know how BPress works. You have to put an HTML code to get the papers up. That's just ridiculous. So for a flagship journal, I just wanted to look more professional. I know that's not your fault.
Maybe AIS people should spend less time vacationing and more time
making Dorothy's journal look even better.
It is so hard to make changes. I mean,
I know
very little I have control over. I can change editorial board names and announcements. That's it.
I know.
I can't even add new like special issues. I got to type those up into just a Word doc, but I can't even myself add those. I mean, it's so little I can do on the website side, which is a shame.
It is a shame, and that's something that we, not you, but we as a community have to fix. Because I think it has been the right strategy to up the quality, the reputation, the legitimization of that journal. That has already happened. It has wonderful articles. It's looking great for the future, but it has to look great too. I mean, we got to put some money into this. If someone said like, hey, can all the different department heads and whatever, can they all put $500 to it? Yeah, I'll give you $500. I don't care. I want this to look better than what it is. And I know it's not your fault. I know you have very little leeway as an editor-in-chief yourself.
So I agree with you, but look at like ASQ, for example. It's as prestigious as you get, and it's pretty lame, the looks. But then you look at like Science and Nature. What's that?
They're not IT people.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and you look at Science and Nature, and they look fantastic.
Yeah.
All right. Huh. Well, Dorothy, it was an absolute pleasure having you. This is fantastic. Lots of gems. You know what? I think this episode is like the Christina Alamos and Giannis Kalinikos paper that we gave an award to, because it's full of gems. This episode is full of little gems, I think, for authors and, for people that want to make their papers better and so forth. So I think people if you've just listened to this, listen to it again. Go on a treadmill, do some more exercise, get your bike out once again, do another round, round about the rim or whatever, and then listen to it again. There's more gems that you haven't heard of. So thanks so much for coming, Dorothy.
It was really fun. Y'all are great. I love your podcast.
Thanks, Dorothy.